Hi, it's great to be here. I think for academic researchers like us, you're a dream audience. You're the people we want to reach, and you're the people we want to convince. So I'll do my best to do that. I guess I'll try to do a little bit. I know we're a little late, but I'll do. Joanna, you keep me posted. What I want to do is basically give you a sense of what behavioral science thinks and tries to do that's different from what you might have gotten from policy schools, business schools, and other places. So assumptions that we make, sometimes intuitively, sometimes not even explicitly, about what drives people, what motivates them, their tastes, have an enormous impact on the policies that we design. And it turns out that those assumptions, while it's critical for what we do, don't always go questioned. What I'm going to try to juxtapose are two views of the human agent. There is the classical kind of rational agent model view that dominates not just business schools and policy schools, but also governments. Or the assumption is that people have pretty clear preferences, they have pretty well-ordered preferences, they know what to do as long as you give them a well-functioning economy and a well-functioning market to go about optimizing their preferences. The most extreme view, of course, is in the US, probably more extreme than in Europe, where government should not interfere, let people do the best they can, and they don't need any help from anybody. That's the most extreme view on the one side. The other side is the view that I come to sell you here, which is a profoundly behavioral view. It looks at people the way we know them, our boyfriends, our girlfriends, our grandmothers, our parents, sort of myopic, confused, vindictive, inconsistent, the people as we know them. And it turns out that that view has enormous implications for how we want to think about designing the world in which people inhabit their everyday lives. That's what I want to talk about. Some of the content, some of the words that I want to leave you with, some of the new terms I want you to think about are context, construal, issues about mental life, scarcity bandwidth, and good and bad psychology. Those are the issues, if I succeed, will make more sense to you in 45 minutes than they do now. That's the agenda. So I'm going to start with context. Context is absolutely critical, and I never know how to start other than with really classic studies that happened 40 years ago, 50 years ago. They really have entered popular culture, and some of you have seen them, but I want to give you my rendition of these studies for 2 minutes. So these are basically psychologists who are obsessed in the 60s with understanding the German mind. What happened in Germany in the Second World War? We now, of course, know there's nothing German about it. It's the mind that all of us carry behind the eyes and between the ears. But at the time, surprisingly, it was not clear. I'll give you one study that's in some detail. This is Stanley Milgram's famous study done in the basement of the psychology department at Yale. Milgram invites middle-aged men to participate in the study. Do I have a pointer? They think they're being assigned randomly to teacher or students, but in fact, all of them will be teachers. The student, the man sitting down in the white shirt attached to electrodes, is a Confederate. He's an actor. He's working for the experimenter. The subject meets them. They go to the other side of the partition, and there is a learning experiment. It's going to be relevant. You teach the subject paired associates. I teach you house, banana. Later, when I say house, you, the student, when I attach electrodes, you're supposed to say banana. If you get it right, bravo, we move on. If you get it wrong, I'll give you a slight electric shock. This is very carefully choreographed so that the actor is following a very careful script. When the subject thinks he's giving 75 to 105 volts, the actor, the student on the other side of the partition, grunts. It gets louder and louder. At 270, there's screams of agony. At some point, he says, "Get me out of here. I told you I have heart trouble," which he happens to mention when they first meet. If you choose to keep going after the screams of agony, at 3:30, roughly around here, every time you push it down, you can see where you last pushed the button. And roughly around here, at 3:30, you say house, and there's total silence. Nothing comes back after the man has screamed and told you his heart trouble. 3:40, 3:50, 3:60, up to 4:50. If you choose to keep going, there's no sound coming back. That's the way it's structured. Why would anybody do anything like this? There is a distinguished gentleman who works for Yale University, looking very self-important in a white robe, as you saw before, standing saying, "Please continue. The experiment requires you to go on. It's important that you continue." That's the sort of pressure on the participants. Stanley Milgram, who was brilliant, here is a close-up of the machine. It goes into XXX, danger. Milgram, who was brilliant, among other things, had the insight to ask people to predict what will subjects do. So we have the data. He asks regular Americans as well as psychiatrists. He tells them the exact story and tells them, what do you think people will do? Everybody predicts disobedience. The average prediction is at 135. When the grunts get a little bit louder, people will refuse to go on. Nobody predicts that anybody will go above 300, except for the psychiatrists in the US and the Northeast who recognize problems and predict that 1 in 1,000 will be a sociopath who will keep going higher. Those are the data. What happens? What happens is that everybody goes above 300, and 65% of these nice men in New Haven are sociopaths. Now, we can spend a lot of time talking about this. We know for a fact this is a discovery about human behavior that the experts in the 1960s and 70s did not know. We also know that we can talk about this all day, and most of us will go home thinking we wouldn't be doing this. In other words, we just don't get it. And again, this is one study out of many. You can teach a whole semester on this. The number one lesson I think that comes from the behavioral sciences that's going to be extremely important to your lives and to your work if you take it seriously is that context has an enormous impact on what we do, and that we tend not to get it. Now, when I say context, I don't mean electrocuting people. It could be the way you arrange a shelf in the supermarket. It could be the way a banker speaks to you when you come into the bank. It could be how you design a health clinic. Any place you go, a classroom, a workplace, nuances and context have an enormous impact. And we tend not to understand or not to get them seriously enough. And I'll give you some examples in a minute, but that has an enormous importance. And the bad news is we're not getting it. The good news is if you get it, you really have enormous power because you can design contexts with some nuance that makes a difference. The other concept that I want to propose to you is a little bit more academic, but it's kind of important. When you think about standard economic theory or just how we think about people, we talk about people's preferences in the world. Do they prefer job 1 or job 2? Do they want to buy car 1 or car 2? I'm going to emphasize this is not a postmodern sophisticated claim. It's a profoundly trivial observation. It's not interesting even. But when people choose between these houses and between these cars and between these jobs, they're not choosing between those things in the world. They're choosing between those things as they are represented in their head. Now that's obvious, but it has enormous implications. Because how you represent something in your head and how it is in the world is not one-to-one. A lot of behavioral economics boils down to the idea that if I describe the same choice in slightly different ways, you choose differently because you've created a different representation, different construal of the situation. So again, people are not choosing things in the world, they're choosing things in the world as they are represented in their machinery. And that ends up being critical because how you describe, how you present what's available for consideration plays an enormous role in the construal that I create. And these two issues, context and construal, are everywhere. I'll give you a few quick examples, but just to convince you that it's dominant. So on the one extreme, here is, I don't know how well you see this. If you see this well enough, you will be pretty sure. If I ask you in 2D, forget three-dimensional cues, just in 2D, how do these cars compare? If you have a pretty good view of it, you'll be convinced that this one is bigger on the screen than this one. But in fact, they're identical. It's hard to convince you. What I'm going to try to do, if you believe me, I'm going to take a line and simply cut and paste it 3 times. And here it is. And you can see that it's exactly the same. You might not have to believe me. And in fact, if you do this in really well visually lit situations, and you put a line on this car, and then move it to cover this car, what people see is the line stretching and contracting rather than believe you that they're the same size. It's very hard to get rid of this illusion. I'm showing you only to say to you, again, notice construal. In this case, as opposed to many others, we have a proof. What you're experiencing is not what's happening in the world. The world is now presenting you 3 identical cars, and you're not able to experience that. What you're representing, what you're construing is something different. And that's just the most extreme case, but this is the kind of thing that we see everywhere we look. Let's ask people simple questions. We do surveys all the time. Some of them are complicated, predict the probability of recessions and wars. Here's a really simple one. Simply tell me, estimate how many hours of television you watch a week. Now, obviously, if you don't have a television, it's 0, and if you never turn it off, which turns out to be true about 1/3 of American households, then it's 170, but you have some sense. So I can ask you this question, please estimate the average number of hours you watch television per week. Or I can ask you, Please estimate the average number of hours you watch television a week. The only thing that's changed is a bit the scale. Now, people know it's above 0. They know it's less than 20. They're trying to figure out, they look at the scale, and they're somewhere in the middle. And what you discover is if you ask the first question, Americans watch about twice as much television than if you ask the second. Now, obviously, if you're strategic about it, you know which one to ask if you want to prove that they watch a little or less. But more interestingly, how do you ask this question context-free? How do you get the real judgment independent of the context? It's very hard to do. It turns out that the numbers people saw a minute ago, what comes to mind, the scale, anything will impact what they give you in ways that are not trivial. And so now, if you think about this, how do we ask people if they want to be willing organ donors? So, when you get a driver's license, you decide whether or not you want to be an organ donor. It's a serious decision. It has to do with your body and your religious beliefs and your social altruistic beliefs, etc. If you haven't seen this, it's worth seeing. This is a graph of the percentage of drivers in different European countries who are willing organ donors. What you see here is the blue countries average 94% willing organ donation rates, and the yellow countries average 14. The Netherlands is a complicated story. I'll leave it out for a moment. So what's the difference in the blue and yellow countries? Now, if you look, it's Austria on one side, Germany on the other, Netherlands, Belgium, what's doing? What's doing is that the blue countries, you're an organ donor unless you opt out. In the yellow countries, you're not an organ donor unless you opt in. That's it. Now, when this paper appeared, it was clear that countries never took this seriously. If I teach you in business school and policy school that people have their preferences, it doesn't matter how you do it. The transaction cost in most of these cases is nothing. It's literally signing the back of your license. So if I believe, sorry, John, if I believe that your preference is set, it doesn't matter how I do it. So countries just did it unthinkingly, and literally after this paper came out, Argentina woke up the next day and changed the default because they just didn't realize it. Notice, what does this tell us about people's preferences about being an organ donor? It doesn't tell us anything. All it tells us is people don't sign. They just don't act on it. If you default them into being, they are. If you default them into not being, they're not. And this is not, or eating spaghetti. This is your body and your organ donation. It's, family, religion. It's a big thing. And this is what you get. And so, as was mentioned before, the intention-action tension between what people do and what they intend to do is quite nuanced. And if we take the easy step of saying, oh, people are doing this, it must be what they want, or they're not doing that, must be what they don't want, we're missing an enormous amount of behavioral play. I love this picture because it kind of captures everything, but this is intention, action, tension. Okay? And it very quickly becomes sort of important. So if you go to a restaurant down the street today, they're competing with other restaurants, and to make you, the American diner, happy, they give you a big plate. So these are the plates in 1960 and 2009. Remember, you have to do pi r squared, so you're getting a lot more spaghetti here than there. And if you look at the data, they're simply stunning. So this is the CDC data. If you go downstairs now and order a hamburger, your average American hamburger, you're eating exactly 3 of your grandmother's hamburgers at lunch 50 years ago. Again, notice this is not an intention. Some Americans got up one morning and say, I want to be obese on hamburgers. They just go in, they have a conversation with a friend, and they eat what's in front of them. And that has an enormous impact. And so, again, if you don't take those contextual nuances, those who like the word nudging seriously, you're hurting people in ways that didn't have to happen without them really benefiting in any way or wanting it. And so this is kind of the world of the behavioral scientist. What people want, what they don't want, I want to respect it, but I need to understand it, because how they act doesn't really tell me they don't want to be an organ donor, they do want to be an organ donor, they do want to eat a pile of spaghetti. I don't know any of this. They're just doing it. FAFSA is probably the single most generous benefit that the American government gives its citizens. We're not so good about giving citizen benefits, but this is one that's pretty good. So if you're a low-income person, you get a lot of money to go to college. It's a life-altering event. You can literally get tens of thousands of dollars to go to college, which has, of course, impact on lifetime earnings. It's a big deal. take-up of FAFSA is about 1/3 of eligibles. So 1/3 of American kids who can benefit enormously take FAFSA. And now comes the question, what does this tell us? Do they not know? Do they not want to go to college? What's doing? This is the, I'm sorry. This is the form. So it's, many pages. In those pages that you've seen many times before are things insulting, saying, we'll penalize you if you lie, and they're overwhelming because they have sentences that you can't even parse. It's a complicated form. Now the question was, what happens with FAFSA? So Philodopoulos and his colleagues did a whole study. The purple is applications and matriculation currently, so 1/3 of eligibles matriculate. They do a study where they say, maybe people don't know. So they go to people and say, I know everything about you. I know about your household income. I know about your parents' income. I've checked. You are eligible for FAFSA. Here's the form. So we've solved the issue of knowing and understanding, and that's the green. Nothing happens. Version number 3. I know everything about you. I know your parents' income, your income. Here's the form. And here's a nice person who will help you fill out the form together. And actual matriculation goes up 25%. Now, this is, how should I put this? The idea that somebody for a minimum wage for 1 hour sits next to you and helps you fill out a form that changes your life is not immediately available if you teach people standard decision making. If you go to policy school where we do cost and benefit analysis, what's the implication? What was the cost to you of doing this form by yourself? What, $40,000, $60,000 for 1 hour? It doesn't compute. It's something completely different. It doesn't lend itself to cost benefit analysis. It's something else. It's not that people are saying, I won't do FAFSA. They say, oh, look at this form. Oh my gosh, I'll wait for my sister to come home from college this weekend. She'll help me. And life goes by. Okay, so these are the nuances where you introduce something that can change people's lives at very low cost, much less costly to have somebody help them than the enormous ad campaigns that have been tried to convince them to go to school. A lot of beautiful work by Behavioural and others on defaulting people into retirement savings. People come to work, you default them into 2% of their income going into retirement or into 5%. You tell them here's a phone number you can call anytime you want, 24/7, and change that allocation to higher or lower. And then you look at people who work at the exact same office. We play ping pong together, we meet at the water cooler every day. And 4 years later, those who are defaulted into higher savings are going to retire significantly richer than those who are defaulted into lower savings, when all you have to do is make a phone call on what is probably one of the biggest financial decisions you'll make. Again, same idea. Those who are you into health, I love the Glow Cap. The Glow Cap has a little $15 capsule that complains if you don't open it in time to take your medication. By complains, it means it lights up, it screeches, and it calls you on your phone saying, open me. And this is a classic case where that on these studies, you have accessibility, you have liquidity, you have the medicine in your pockets. HIV positive is a classic case. You need to take it. Taking it 60% of the time is not 60% good. And life interferes and you forget and you get distracted. And this enters your attentional span at the right moment. It makes a big difference. But then there are also policies, of course, that we need to question in light of this. My pet peeve is with financial literacy. And anybody who's doing financial literacy here, I want to say I love you and respect you, but I worry. And what do I mean by that? If you look at financial literacy, especially in the US, it's obviously done for the poor because they're the ones who are looking bad. They're the ones who are, I don't know anything about finances, but Princeton University takes care of it, I look fine. If you're poor in America, you don't look good, so they do financial literacy. A lot of money and a lot of man and woman power and a lot of policy work is done around financial literacy. There was a recent study, a meta-analysis of over 200 studies that looked at financial literacy training. What you find basically is that people who go through financial literacy training do better on the test. They answer questions better, but it has no impact on their lives. And if you think about it for a moment, imagine that I teach you swimming 101. And after 3 weeks or 3 months of teaching swimming, I take you and I throw you into a massively stormy ocean. You'll drown. If I put you into a nice little calm Geneva lake, you look pretty good. When you take the American poor, give them some training and throw them into massively cruel, unregulated, crazy American banking system, they drown. And so now comes the question, if the context is so imposing that they can't do it well, and you spend a lot of time teaching me this, it's a form of abuse. Leave me alone. Let me read books to my kids. Why are you training me on something where the context is such that I'll never succeed? Now, I'm pushing this and being provocative, but I think those are the kinds of questions we have to ask. Because if you're training people on something where the context works against them powerfully enough, you're only insulting them because you're telling them something they sort of understand, but you're wasting their time and yours. And so those are the kinds of issues we have to ask very seriously. Notice this is very related to intention action. You taught me financial literacy. I understand it. Thank you so much. I want to do it. I can't do it. It's overwhelming. You know, I get all kinds of hidden fees that are overwhelming. And then things go badly. American banking, by the way, is an exotic creation you should look into with some interest. If you imagine the following, I have $100 in savings in my checking account, $100 in my checking account, and I give 5 checks, 4 20s and 100. The bank could pay the 4 20s and bounce the 100. What the bank does, and is free to do legally, is first deposit 100 and then bounce 4 of them at $35 each. And they do that. So I have free checking, and the reason I and many here have free checking is because the poor are paying for it with penalties of the sort that makes this impossible. Anyway, I'm digressing. Which brings us to poverty, and poverty is where I've spent a lot of my time, and I assume it's relevant to you. It's a very parallel universe, but I want to focus on it for a few minutes. Very much like before, there are different perspectives on the poor. On the one hand, by the way, I'm going to say the poor as if I know exactly what that means, but you get me. The rational choice model talks about rational agents. The poor are rational agents just like the rest of us. They're calculating, they have willpower, they do the best they can. If you increase the benefits for children, they'll have more children. If you diminish it, then they'll have less. It's all very calculating. The other view of poverty, trying to explain similar phenomena, assumes all sorts of pathologies, culture of poverty, lack of self-control, and those kinds of issues. You've probably seen many of them. And what my close dear friend and colleague Samuel Munavan and students have been doing is looking at an alternative which says, look, we don't think the poor are perfectly rational. We don't think any of us are perfectly rational. But are the poor really pathological in any way other than the standard, confused, funny way all of us are? And how much sense could we make of the life of the poor if we just look at them as a standard human being in a very powerful context? Poverty is a very powerful context. And how can we make sense of things when we look at it from that perspective? If you look at poverty in general, the poor look very bad. If you look at the world of medicine, people have developed fantastic drugs. All that's left for you now is to take those drugs. Adherence is a big problem in medicine. And if you look at the literature, the poor are the biggest culprits. They're the ones who fail to adhere to the medications the most, even if you adjust for access and all the rest. Move to weeding in the fields of developing countries. Literature shows that poor farmers weed their fields less than richer farmers next to them, with serious loss of income. Parenting, infinite number of shelves on how the poor are inconsistent parents, inattentive parents, all kinds of critiques. And finances. Again, I'm not going to talk about payday loans here. We can talk a lot. If you want to talk about payday loans later, we can do it in the discussion. Lots of ways in which the poor look myopic, inconsistent, bad planners, etc. To give you an example, we analyze in our book a lot the sorts of behavior you see here. There is Sandal on the bottom right. This is a giant market outside of Chennai in India. And these are fruit and flower vendors. And these women basically on a regular basis wake up at 5 in the morning. They go and they buy that, they borrow 1,000 rupees. They buy that day's supplies of flowers or mangoes and whatever which is itself interesting what they decide to invest that day. They go spend the entire day in the market selling the stuff, if all goes well, for 1,100. And they go back and give the lender 1,050. Get up at 5 in the morning, borrow 1,000, sell for 1,100, give back 1,050. Every day, super hard life for 10 years. They're paying 5% interest daily. If you compute it, you'll see that if they simply eat 1 dosa or 1 cup of tea less a day, in 50 days, if they borrow a little bit less every day, they can be debt-free and double their earnings. Instead of 50, they make 100 rupees a day. And the question is, why is this not happening? And I'm just giving you a sense of the kind of behaviors that you see that are criticized in the lives of the poor. There are a lot of issues that people bring up in the study of behavior under poverty. It could be peer effects, education, neighborhood. I'm putting this here to say I'm not dismissing any of this. All this plays a role, no doubt. Some probably bigger than others. But I'm going to do something a bit different. I'm going to abstract from all this and simply look, what is the psychology that occurs in context of poverty that creates the behaviors that we worry about, that we study. So this is the work that Senel and I did. And just to give you a preview of the story, the argument is going to be that poverty, scarcity on itself, creates a mindset. In particular, people are spending an enormous amount of cognitive capacity juggling the insufficient resource. If I'm poor in money, we talk a lot about the fact that it could be time, it could be food. But if I'm poor in money, a lot of my cognitive capacity is devoted to juggling financial issues. And when a lot of my cognitive capacity is devoted to juggling financial issues, there is just less mind left for other things. And when there's less mind left for other things in context of poverty, bad things happen. That's going to be the story. Now, I should say before we move on, the poor, people who you study, but this can be done in India and China and the US, are really good at doing everyday finances. So there's a lot of studies in marketing and other areas. If you simply stand out of the supermarket, and when people come out, you ask them to see the receipt, and you ask them, how much did you pay for the pasta today? How much did you pay in the supermarket today? How much was the sauce? The poor know the answers a lot better than the rich, by a lot. This is a study that was a lot of fun. We did this in South Station in Boston. People came out, we asked them for their household income, we divided them into rich and poor, and asked them, when you get into a taxi in Boston, what does the meter read when you first get in? Now, it's a fun case because taxis are clearly something that the rich take much more than the poor, and they're much less likely to know the answer. And so the image I want to leave you with is when you're comfortable, when you're wealthy and you enter a taxi in Boston, you sit back and you look at the beautiful, sunny Charles River. And when you're poor, you're looking at the meter. That's really the metaphor for what we're finding. You're basically what we call tunneling. You're tunneling on what's urgent. That's where your mind is. And other things that you realize are important are in the periphery. They're left for later. And when you're tunneling on what's urgent and leave important stuff in the periphery for later, bad things happen. Now, again, I don't want to spend time on this today, but when we talk about this in the book, one thing we try to do is create an empathy bridge to try to make this palpable for people such as you. I assume most of you are not in poverty, but you're very busy. And the argument is something very similar happens. So think of yourself tunneling. You have a project to do tomorrow at 10 a.m., big report. You're going to spend a lot of the night tunneling on this report. You might do fairly well, but other things that are important, feeding your puppy, your mother's birthday, are going to be in the periphery. You're going to forget them. And that's the idea. And when you're in poverty and you forget things, bad things happen. The word we've done is forgiving. So that's kind of the story. All this relies on an important fact that I want to just explain to you. Our bandwidth, what we can attend to at one time, is extremely limited. Okay, so although you probably heard this already before, but all this idea of divided attention, most of it not working. People can only attend to one thing and the rest just gets neglected. Multitasking is another way of saying not paying attention, basically. Studies on cell phones are stunning. So in many states in the US today, you're not allowed to hold your cell phone while you drive. This is only because you can only sell to the American public the idea that the hands interfere. All the researchers know the hands have nothing to do with it. It's in your head. And if you take people in simulators and have them talk on a cell phone, no hands held, just talking on the cell phone while you drive, your reaction time and your ability to detect the periphery equals somebody who's legally drunk. Okay? Because our cognitive capacity is very limited. A lot of beautiful studies. Here is basic intuition. If I ask this half of the room, please remember 2 digits, 17. Don't forget 17. And I ask this half, please don't forget 7 digits, 1728695. Don't forget. You can do it, but while you're keeping those 7 digits, you will eat less well, You will again forget your partner's birthday. You will be less likely to notice somebody dressed as a clown on a unicycle going through the room. Your head is full. And the intuition here is that when you're juggling poverty, it's a little bit like walking around the world holding 7 digits. Your head is full. And that's the intuition. Now, this is a beautiful study. I'll tell you this briefly. This is a school in Connecticut where researchers, sociologists found a classroom, an elementary school, had 2 classrooms. One was on the quiet side of the school. The other half of the kids were near a train track. Outside the window were trains. So there were basically the trains occasionally going through the outside of the class. Are trains distracting? Yeah, they're distracting. How distracting are they? What these researchers find is that these kids in 5th grade are 1 year behind in academic performance when they're on the train side of the school. They then install soundproofing and the kids catch up. It's a massive effect. And again, the image I want to leave you with is imagine yourself now in a perfectly quiet room. No trains, perfectly peaceful. And you're worried about rent for Monday. And you're worried about getting food for your kids tonight. Those are internal trains. Those trains don't have to be outside the head. If you have these internal trains, they're going to impact your ability just as much as the trains outside the window for these kids. That's basically the intuition. And so a lot of what we talk about is scarcity as a form of cognitive demand. It demands a lot of your cognitive capacity and there's less left. I'll give you a couple of quick studies. This is done in the mall in New Jersey. We ask people to sit and participate in a study. We pay them to participate. They sit in front of a computer. We're going to give them financial scenarios of everyday life. Your car breaks down. It's going to cost X dollars to fix. Think about how you're going to take care of this problem. And all these scenarios come in 2 versions, manageable and challenging. The manageable version, the car is going to cost $100 to fix, which we know for most everybody in the mall is doable. The challenging version, the car is going to cost $1,500 to fix, which we know for many people in this mall is a major challenge. So you get one of these 2 scenarios and you think how you're going to take care of it and tell us. And to make things interesting, while you're thinking about all this, we're going to give you little games to play on the computer. And these games happen to be classic instruments in cognitive psychology. The one on the left, you have to respond as quickly as you can. Same side if you see a heart, and opposite side if you see a flower. It's very confusing. It's a divided attention task. It's like a driving test. We know that if you keep 7 digits in your head, you'll do this a lot worse than if you keep 2. Okay? And this is a progressive matrices. This is the most standard component of fluid intelligence on the IQ test. All of you have taken some version of this before. I know for a fact if you're in this room. It's what every employer, every school, everybody gives to kids. And again, we give them this to do while they're thinking about these problems. We divide them by household income, a median split into high and poor income. So what happens? If we look at the cognitive control, that's a driving test. What we're seeing here is the rich worried about the easy or the complicated, challenging car. The rich do just as well driving if they're worried about the $100 car they need to fix or the $1,500 car. No difference, they drive just as well. Their poor friends in the mall, when they're worried about the $100 car, drive just as well. But when the poor in the mall, instead of 2 digits, are now worried about the $1,500 car, they drive, their cognitive control is diminished significantly. They just perform less well. They're driving less well, if you will. Fluid intelligence, I don't know what happened there. This is the rich, they do just as well. The poor are indistinguishable from the rich when they're worried about the manageable car, and they're significantly less capable. They lose the equivalent of 12 to 13 IQ points when they're worried about the challenging car. Now, this is a big effect. It's near a standard deviation. In the high school, the public high school where my kids go, 13 IQ points is enough to take you on a qualitative scale from gifted to from average to borderline deficient, or from average to borderline gifted. It's a big effect. And this is the effect you see here. When the poor, who a minute ago were just as capable as their rich friends, are now keeping 7 digits with this financial challenge. We know, by the way, from completely separate research, if I kept you all night with Eminem blasting in the background, you would be here today about 9 IQ points less capable. So think of yourself taking a test after not sleeping all night, And these guys are feeling worse than that once financial challenges and juggling concerns impose themselves on their ability to manage this test. Okay, I won't get into all the details. We're comparing here the rich and the poor in the US. We've controlled for everything, but the rich and the poor are different. Different blood rates, different education. Maybe there's some complicated interaction we don't see. The dream was, can we do this within subjects? Not easy to get a subject to be both poor and rich, but we ended up with a nice population. These are sugarcane farmers in southern India. Sugarcane farming is a good example because these are people for whom at least 65 or 70% of their income literally comes in one day when the company pays for the sugar. So these are people who basically, because they failed to smooth, because they ran out of money too soon, they're poor before the harvest and they're rich after. So we run the same people now in handheld devices in the field 4 months apart, 2 months before harvest and 2 months after harvest. I won't get into all the details, but if you look at reaction time and errors, they're about 9 or 10 IQ points less capable during scarcity than during plenty. Now these are the same people, same education, same health, same everything. We can't control for sleep, but it's pretty close. So notice, by the way, in the debate, I'm going to be a little bit vulgar here, but in a debate about, are you poor because you're stupid or are you stupid because you're poor, this is very clear. These are people who are just as capable as their rich friends when things are fine, losing capacity when poverty imposes itself on their ability to function. And in general, this behavioral perspective, especially as applied to the poor, has enormous policy implications. So the juggling challenges that you encounter, how difficult life is not just a function of your income. It's a function of managing your everyday life. And so this is where all of you enter the story. If you have buffer savings, if you have predictable income, if you have forgiving banks, all those things make your juggling significantly easier. And what's interesting, because our intuition is so wrong, in many places, even those who want to help the poor feel they need to educate them. You have to be here exactly at 8 o'clock, you have to wear a good shirt, you have to bring a tie. All those things you're doing are basically imposing more bandwidth requirements on you. I already have a problem leaving my kid with somebody to take care of in time and having unreliable public transportation. Now you insist that I wear a tie before 8 o'clock. If you think in terms of bandwidth, imagine somebody comes for a loan and you say to them it's going to cost you $200. What do you mean? I need money. These people need bandwidth, and when you impose these strict requirements to educate them, you're making them pay bandwidth. It's a little bit like making them pay money when they need a loan. And so it really needs to think about how you rearrange the world to be much more forgiving. We talk a lot about things like, for example, class. Imagine I want to have you take a course, and the course is every Monday at 6. And you have a complicated life. You miss 1 or 2 Mondays, you're out. Why not have this course start Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday? When you miss Monday 1 week, you come Tuesday instead. You create a world that's forgiving to let people manage their juggling needs and their limited bandwidth to succeed rather than fail. Just like you can create a context that eases juggling, you can of course create a context that makes it more complicated and harder. I'll give you one example just because it's so relevant. If you remember, during Clinton, we imposed a 5-year lifetime limit on welfare recipients in the US. It's a good example because probably the Clinton administration didn't mean to hurt these people. But look, imagine I say to you now, this was a delightful event. Please, if you don't mind, send me 1 paragraph about your thoughts in 5 years. What do? 4 years, 11 months, 3 weeks, you don't do anything. And then you say, oh my God, that jerk wanted a paragraph. Right? When you take the poor who are tunneling on dinner tonight and rent for Friday, and you tell them in 5 years you lose your benefit, you're totally outside their tunnel. They're worried about Friday. What are you telling them about 5 years? And when you discover that, and people worried about it before, but you discovered as the poor woke up one day and said, oh my God, I'm losing my benefits in 6 months. So this is a classic case. If you don't take seriously the tunneling and the juggling bandwidth limitations of the poor, you impose a policy that penalizes them but totally fails to motivate them. What you need instead is something that enters my tunnel. Either remind me or do it, 10 half-year limits instead of 1 5. Do something that gets to me while I'm juggling. It makes it easier rather than wait in the corner and wait with a big penalty when I'm not ready. Those are the issues. I'm going to run a bit quickly here. There's an irony to poverty. The problems are bigger. Bandwidth limitations are more severe. The context is more unforgiving. Everything is in the wrong direction, including lots of lack of help and disrespect. And that's kind of remarkable. If you think about the amount of help that we get every day, the automatic deposits, the warnings from the bank, the emails, the lawyers, the gardeners, the drivers, the accountants, all the stuff we get, but the poor who need it more never get. It's remarkable. So those who need the help less get an enormous amount of help, and those who need it more get at best sabotaged. You know, they get these hidden fees that make banking impossible. And so that's a really profound issue, and it's part of the human condition. And the disrespect has an enormous impact. So there are a lot of Americans who are unbanked who used to be banked, and it was so insulting and demeaning. And when I went with my kids, because I don't have a babysitter, into the bank, they looked at me in a way that made it clear I don't belong there. Those small things have an enormous impact. This is a study we did recently. This is not about race. We almost have no race effect. But here's a story. Here is a guy, and he's wearing a shirt that independent judges rate to be poorer than this shirt. Okay? Now again, it's not about race. We have blacks and whites. Here is a guy wearing a shirt that's judged to be richer than this shirt. By the way, I learned one thing, if you worry about it, Hawaiian shirts seem to be looking poor. Now, the only thing we ask these people, the only thing we ask them, the whole study is, how competent is this person? It's the identical face. We just change a tiny bit of the shirt, and the effect is enormous. Now, I do this 1 second. The blue is, you look at a person for 1 second, that's about, it gets boring. We're so good at face perception, a second is forever. Half a second, 70 milliseconds, you barely know you saw a face. And that's enough to give the exact same judgment. That's when the shirt is poor, and that's when the shirt is rich. It's a big effect. We get this effect when we tell people, please don't pay attention to the shirt. We get it when we tell people shirts have nothing to do with people's competence. No matter what we do, it's exactly what you get. In a tenth of a second is enough to have an impression of me when I'm presenting myself as poorer, is less competent than if I had fancier clothing. This is very depressing. It basically says that Harvard Business School are right when they teach you to dress well. It's terrible, but it is what it is. And so this is the world we have to struggle with, and we're not going to change our perception overnight, but to understand the context that the poor inhabit, starting from this and going all the way to abusive banks, makes an enormous difference for how you might want to think about helping them solve some of their problems. This is a 100-year-old quote, but it's beautiful. I mean, it starts with an economist. It could be anybody. It could be a taxi driver, a teacher, a parent. If your work depends on how people behave, on people's psychology, you better understand people's psychology. Either you understand it and you do good work, or you don't understand it and you make it up, and it could be bad psychology. That's the quote. So what's bad psychology? I'll give you 2 minutes on bad psychology. Okay, I'm going to give you a hypothetical and a real. The hypothetical one, so Pareto optimality, all of us have come to know and love Pareto optimality. It basically, Pareto basically says, if there's a state of the world where some of us are better off and nobody is worse off, that's a better place to go. It's sort of logically compelling, can't really be wrong, except it may be wrong in dollars and in yen and in marks. And what do I mean by that? There is very good evidence to suggest that if I gave this half of the room a 2% raise, and this half was equally meritorious, 100% raise, well-being in the room would have gone down. Okay, everybody's getting more dollars, but there's a lot of evidence suggesting that if GDP or income goes up, but inequality goes up, well-being does not go up. Now, this is a purely behavioral fact. It didn't have to be this way. Not true. It's true about dogs or monkeys, but it's true about us. Actually, there is some evidence in monkeys may be like us. But in any case, this is a deep issue because it basically says that you have to be careful what it means to have a better world, and inequality might really interfere with our standard evaluations of GDP. Much more benign example. For many years in the U.S., there was a two-tier welfare law. Two-tier welfare law said that if you're a welfare recipient who moves from state A to state B, if state B, California, pays higher welfare payments than the state you came from, say Alabama, for the first year of residence, you only get your former state's level payments, not the new state. Now, why would you do this? You do this because, you know, the people in Washington have this idea that if one state pays more, all the welfare recipients, all the single mothers, you know, will jump into the SUVs and go there, and we have to stop this completely, you know, excursion. So they do this limits. Now, it's remarkable because when this law was introduced, there was data. And the data, if you looked at it, showed that mobility from lower to higher paying states equaled mobility from higher to lower paying states. Most welfare recipients do not check where they pay more and move. They move because they have a sister who can help with babysitting. They move because they got a job. They move because they have a family member who can help, or because they find an apartment. That's why you move. Now, what happens when you move? This is one example. In $1993, if you move from Mississippi to California, for the first 12 months of residence, instead of getting $565, which in Oakland barely allows you to exist, they give you $120, which guaranteed your demise. And so this is a policy, it's a nice example because it's a policy driven simply by the wrong assumption. If you don't understand what moves people, you create an incentive that's completely misplaced and destroy them. One more example. This is my dear friend Redomar in Canada. Emergency rooms in Ontario have a big problem. The homeless hang out in the emergency room in big numbers. You don't want the homeless in the emergency room, and so doctors and nurses have been sort of very reluctant to help them. And Redomar and his colleagues, based on some interviews, had a suspicion. So they did a randomized controlled trial with great care. Half the homeless in the emergency rooms all over Ontario were given a standard treatment, and the other half received compassionate treatment. An intern stuck around with them, asked them what they could do to help them, really kind of did all they could to make them feel better. The follow-up was very clear. The tendency to come back to that or any other emergency room in the province was significantly lower for those who got the compassionate treatment as opposed to those who got the standard treatment. And turns out that if you're homeless and you come to the emergency room, not with a life-threatening ailment, but just a shoulder that helps, a knee that hurts or something, and you feel they didn't take good care of you, they didn't pay attention to you, you come again. But if you feel they gave you the best care they could, you have no interest in coming back to the emergency room. So it's a beautiful case where basically being compassionate solves the problem, while being mean and indifferent makes it bigger. Again, just based on a misunderstanding of what's driving people to do what they're doing. I think I'm going to skip this for now. I'll talk about it because I want to give you some more time. Okay, the behavioral perspective, I'll give you kind of a glimpse of it. The behavioral perspective, if you think about it, has enormous implications for a lot of the work that dominates this institution and can make a big difference. And I would argue, to the extent that we can make a difference, we basically sign covenants that obligate us to do so. If we can reduce fear, if we can reduce want in ways that we understand better, not doing it sort of violates certain agreements that we've made. And so I thank the organizers here for doing this. I think getting some of you to think this way could be a really wonderful small step in a promising direction. Okay, thank you.